Welcome, everyone. My name is Grzymala-Busse. I'm the director of the Europe Center here at Stanford University. And today it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome Matthias Matthijs, who is an associate professor of international political economy. He's an expert on the politics of economic crises, the role of economic ideas in economic policymaking, and the politics of regional integration. He's the author of Ideas in Economic Crises in Britain, From Attlee to Blair, and also the editor with Mark Blyth of The Future of the Euro, a very timely still publication. He's also a senior fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations and serves as the chair of the European Union Studies Association. And today he will show us how the European market is more integrated than an American one, in a title with the characteristically mischievous title, Why Europe's Single Market Surpasses America. So welcome, Matthias, and looking forward to it.
Thank you, Anna, first of all, for the invitation. Share my slides and see. You can see them, right?
Yeah.
I'm in presentation mode. So I think everybody who gives a Zoom talk now says the same thing. It would have been obviously more fun to be in Palo Alto on campus in the spring. We were supposed to do this last year already, so this is much delayed. And last year we very much hoped, actually we're sure that this would be in person. So anyway, here we are. To all of those of you like myself who have Zoom fatigue, I salute you, and I'll try to keep it relatively light for the next hour. So this is joint work with Craig Parsons at the University of Oregon and his former PhD student Benedict Springer, who's done a lot of the kind of data gathering, especially legislatively for this paper. And again, it's a slightly mischievous title. It's mostly Craig who likes to provoke even more than I do when it comes to academic audiences. And the question is, why did Europe's single market surpass America's, right? And so I want to be absolutely clear, right, that we're talking about regimes here, regimes of single markets, and not, by no means is there more trade between France and Germany than there is between New York and Ohio or anything like this, right? So when it comes to trade flows, it's still quite slight, about double. So if the US interstate trade is about 40% of GDP of goods and services, in Europe it's still about 20%. And of course, when it comes to people moving across borders, it's probably a factor of 10 still, right? But so we're mostly interested in single markets as political projects and how Europe, the European Union on the one hand, and the United States in the last 50 years, when the world saw the embrace, first slowly and then quite quickly, of neoliberal thinking, ended up at actually quite opposite sides of the aisle. So in general, and this is quite common, whether you read scholarly literature or political science or economists or more popular magazines, literature, the news, and so on, is often what you see people and analysts, they present Europe's single market as an incomplete imitation of America's, right? And so that's true. For example, my former colleague at American University, Michelle Egan, has a very good book published a few years ago by Oxford University Press called Single Markets. And she starts out, very first line in the book, she quotes former commissioner, EU Commissioner Viviane Reding, saying, we could learn a lot from America about how to utilize and develop a single market. Economists, and this is a report from Bruegel, the kind of best known economics think tank in Europe based in Brussels, say it is estimated that remaining non-tariff obstacles, in particular in services sectors, limit intra-EU trade to a level about 4 times smaller than the intensity of trade between US states. By completing the single market, the EU could generate significant income gains. And here also, very recently, September 2019, a big report in The Economist, British weekly magazine. In theory, the EU's 500 million citizens live in a single economic zone, much like America, with nothing to impede the free movement of goods, services, people, and capital. But in reality, Europe's single market is creaking and incomplete. And so that's a very common story, right? And it's the body that promotes this view the most is actually the European Commission itself, right? They constantly say, and it's almost on every announcement about economics or growth or in the Eurozone, in the European Union, well, one of the things, of course, we need to do is, quote unquote, complete the single market, right? Make it more like America's. And that if we get rid of barriers to services trade through the movement of people, recognition of diplomas, things like this, then we will actually be able to achieve the level of economic integration when measured in economic flows that the United States has today. So now, before I move to comparing the European Union case with the United States from a single market regulation and regime point of view, I wanted to do something slightly counterintuitive and look at theories of European integration that have been long established. And I'm sure Anna was forced to learn them at some point in her during graduate school. And if you, let's say you applied European integration theory to the United States. So bear with me for a minute, right? So if you start with what's in the United States, at least the best known theory of liberal intergovernmentalism, mostly associated with Andy Moravcik's Choice for Europe book published in 1998, the idea was there that cross-border exchange incentivizes interest groups to prefer interstate opening. So these interest groups, mostly producer groups, exporters, service producers, would ask or support governments to negotiate these kind of credible commitments to central rules. So they want to lock in a big part of the achievements. And so in IR context, states do so actually with minimal concessions of sovereignty. So let me quote you Moravcik's former advisor, Bob Keohane. He said, sovereignty and self-help mean that the principles and rules of international regimes will necessarily be weaker than those in domestic society, right? So you should expect the rules of the single market in Europe being much weaker than the rules in the United States, which of course is a federal state, while the European Union is an international organization of federal nation states. So that for liberal intergovernmentalism. So US should have a much stronger internal market rules. If you take that other theory, its biggest rival, if you want, of liberal intergovernmentalism, neo-functionalism and its many allies, so building on the work of Ernie Haas at Berkeley, already starting in the late 1950s, so Sandholz, Alex Stone-Sweet, and so on, they're saying, well, cross-border exchange incentivizes interest groups to prefer interstate opening. Governments then delegate authority to supranational institutions, and supranational agents then gain resources, organizational positions to encourage further delegation. So the legal version is legal mandates invite expansive interpretations, elicit interest group allies. So again, here, the US should have much stronger internal market rules from a neo-functionalist perspective. And just for good measure, I'll throw in cultural and ideational accounts, right, that were promoted by many of my good friends and co-authors in the late 90s, early 2000s. EU as neoliberal market building project, Kate McNamara's currency work, the currency of ideas, 1998 book, Nicola Żabko, In the Name of the Market, right, Playing the Market book, 2006. The EU as a political project to build central authority, Parsons 2000, so Craig's book 2003. So if the EU goes so far for these reasons, for cultural ideas reasons, should US internal market authority go even further, right? Because by any measure, the United States has much more pro-market ideational context than the European Union, or especially France and Germany, the driving forces of the European Union, and a much stronger political identity, right? After all, the United States is a war-fighting state. It's nowhere near the ambitions of the European Union today, let alone 30, 40 years ago. So the puzzle really in this paper is that all these expectations seem very wrong. With respect to internal market restrictions on state regulatory autonomy, there's no question that EU legal principles are actually much stronger than in the United States. There's no question that the EU has radically more systematic and ambitious legislation to enact such principles, and these come from the center, right? There's also no question that the EU is more active administratively to implement them, right? So think about it, hundreds of bureaucrats sitting in Brussels right now, and their day job really is to look for barriers to internal trade, goods, services, and movement of people, and so on, to find discrimination and to get rid of them. There's no equivalent federal bureaucracy here in Washington, D.C., 3 miles from where I'm sitting right now. So sure, EU enforcement of that is far from perfectly effective, but it is not plausible to say that it's generally ignored. The key point is the EU today tries to administer internal openness at a level that the US never even considers, right? And so this is true. I mean, I can give you thousands of examples of this, right? This is true in many ways in goods, right? Think about the way things are taxed, right? Especially true for alcohol. I was just at the beach in Delaware, and everybody from Maryland drives just 10 miles over the border because it's tax-free there. When it comes to procurement, public procurement in states, this is true. Whether it comes to licensing, hairdressers who move from Pennsylvania to Ohio have to get retrained and recertified all over again, but a hairdresser from Berlin can move to Madrid. So there are so many examples that I can give you, right, to kind of point to this. What's also striking is that this is similar in legislation. So we've seen a tremendous amount of legislation being done in the European Union to strengthen the internal market, and we haven't seen this really to a similar level in the United States, right? So the big question we should be asking is not why is EU administration of the single market so incomplete and sometimes so ineffective? It's actually the reverse, right? Why does the EU administer a single market more aggressively than the US or any other federation in history for that matter, right? So if you look at this, so this is collected data of all the legislation in Europe's single market from 1953 to 2019. And so you see, of course, initially there were a lot of directives and regulations, and there recently in the last kind of 15, 20, 30 years, there's been much more kind of enforcing legislative acts to actually make these decisions real. But even here, you see the percentage of all EU legislative acts that are concerned with the single market, right? Even in the last 20 years, they've gone up from roughly 25, 30% to close to 50%. This has gone on during the Euro crisis, during the migration crisis, actually even during the pandemic, right? They've continually been doing this. If you look at the US federal single market legislation, right? A lot of things were kind of set very early on. But if you look at the period since roughly 1970s, right? Very little of this has been single market oriented, right? A lot of this has been purely prudential, right? When it comes to finance, insurance, and things of that nature. So it's a simple way of summarizing the regimes. There's 4 basic options in single market rules. So you can have uniform central regulation, right? That is basically the center regulates everything directly. You could have centrally required mutual recognition. That basically means the home state controls the regulation, and then the host state of the service or the good that comes in has to accept it. You could have central floors, right? Where there's basically partial host state control, meaning there's a minimum to safety standards or environmental standards, but you can go above it locally, which means you can still exclude certain goods that come from other states. And you can have pure host state control, right? So anybody who comes into your state to, let's say, a plumber, a Polish plumber for that matter, Anna, that comes in, you can basically say, okay, here are the ways the regulations you have to follow. So what's striking is that the main EU rules are actually a combination of the top 2. Uniform central regulation, and then centrally required mutual recognition. The main US rules are actually the much less stringent ones. Central floors, I think California is actually a very good example, right? Who basically go above what's federally the minimum, and so can exclude certain service providers that way, or complete host state control, right? Basically, in the end, if you want to be a shrink in Illinois, you have to be licensed there, and they can require anything they want. So what's a better explanation than we ask ourselves in the paper, right? So you could just, and I think I see many of you thinking this already. I mean, I don't see you. I can imagine many of you behind your screens thinking this. Well, it's about need, right? There's a pure functionality here. The US doesn't need strong internal market rules, right? So they have weaker internal openness rules that say you accept that basic fact. US has much higher flows, right? There's the benefits of a fluid economy. They seem to be supported by cultural homogeneity, mobile society, direct action of large federal government. So it's almost overdetermined from that point of view. And why does Europe do all these things? Well, because they need it, right? I mean, they're culturally diverse, they're lower mobility societies, they have much more modest central resources. And so the internal market rules are the main available tool to pursue this fluid economy. Now, of course, many of you know a bit of politics and a bit of political economy. So this sounds common sensical, but you must set it aside because it's not like polities that need it the most will have the most of it, right? I mean, think about any country of the world that has a big need for something. That doesn't mean it will be provided, right? So you must explain concretely in the end why powerful actors chose to pursue, support, accept certain delegations of authority, right? So to put it bluntly, why did Germany and France accept a much more strong delegation of their powers, of their discretionary powers and authority, than to Brussels, to the center of the EU institutions, than did Texas, California, Illinois, New York, to the DC federal government, right? Why would there be more business pressure for central openness rules in Europe? I mean, if there's much bigger flows in the US and there's so much more different regulation, it must be much more costly in the US to many more businesses, right? So why aren't they pushing for this? Why would central institutional actors not try to expand their authority in the US? I mean, supposedly politicians want power. I mean, why is Paul Ryan, a real free market believer, when he's Speaker of the House, not passing one act after the other to make this a more perfect market? And why would, again, as I said, Germany and Italy accept delegations of authority that California or Texas successfully opposed? And that's even true, and that's another paper Craig and I are working on, even true in fiscal affairs, right? Think about it. A few years ago, in 2018, Italy had a budget, and they had a populist government of the Lega and the Five-Star Movement that was kind of anti-EU, or at least Eurosceptic. Now, before they could even debate this in Parliament in Rome, they had to send it to Brussels for approval, to a Eurocrat who said, we don't like it, send it back. Just imagine for a moment that the Texas governor, let's say it's a Republican, has a Republican legislature, has to send his budget, or hers, to DC for approval by a federal bureaucrat. I mean, I think there's more reasons or less reasons for secession on the part of Texas, right? So there are these kind of things that are going on in the European Union that are genuinely puzzling from this point of view. So we focus not just on ideas, but on ideas and political coalitions and a certain kind of combination of the two, right? There's already a large literature that theorizes that public policy trajectories reflect context-specific framing and legitimation, but we focus on political coalitions and contingent events that link problems, policy solutions, institutional models in very distinct ways, right? So this really is a tale of varieties of neoliberalism, right? Of very different coalitions that push for it. So this literature has already been addressed, and I don't need to explain this. You know, how did we get the Reagan Revolution in the US? And neoliberalism got linked to a conservative agenda of states' rights. Europe's single market project was linked to neoliberalism and was made to be a kind of force for stronger EU central authority. So they provide theoretically unified accounts of differing outcomes. And as I'll briefly come back to at the end, if there's time left, I think I have about 15 minutes, Anna, 10, 15 minutes, then it's one of the explanations of the appeal of Brexit, because Britain always kind of uncomfortably fell in between these two accounts, right? What both say, Barnier, let's say, Michel Barnier, as he was negotiating for the EU, and the United States views of neoliberalism, of free markets, right? They say we represent the true version of free markets. And of course, Brexit was saying, well, no, Brexit is the true version of free markets, right? Which is actually closer to the American variant. So what's the core of the US story? And again, I can send you the paper if you want to see this in greater detail. Well, in the end, there was quite a modest federal commerce clause action before the 1930s. The New Deal, the 1930s, that we hear so much about in the news, expanded commercial clause authority in the 1940s, but for progressive purposes, right? So not to make this a more perfect market. Later, Reagan neoliberals could nonetheless have used this authority for liberalization, but they didn't, right? Because their coalition was one of states' rights, right? They built their political coalition with social conservative, and you could say, you know, often racist, openly racist states' rights reaction to that New Deal. So what was the story in the United? So neoliberalism becomes focused on weakening central authority, and it generates this kind of powerful knowledge regime about decentralized market regulation that John Campbell and Ove Peterson talk about in their 2014 book. So how did the US case work? So you start with the New Deal, where there's quite a strengthening of central authority, right? Massive increases in federal taxation and so on. So this is a coalition against laissez-faire business, rural states, plus urban lower classes, eventually also including blacks. This leads to a business reaction that pushes back against federal government power, and a traditional conservative reaction that doesn't believe that government should have much to do with our lives, right? There if you remember, Senator from North Carolina, Strom Thurmond, you had the sudden racist reaction to this as well. So briefly, William Buckley at the National Review tried to fuse this in a kind of synthesis where he combined sudden racist reactions, business reactions, traditional conservative reactions, and of course, there's Milton Friedman's neoliberalism, and briefly attempted under Barry Goldwater in 1964, of course, proved unsuccessful because Lyndon Johnson won that election in a light landslide. So I'm coming now closer, much home to the Stanford home. Thanks to AEI, the Heritage Foundation, of course, the Hoover Institution at Stanford, Cato Institute, the Federalist Society, this gets aggressively promoted, this coalition, right? There's a lot that happens, of course, between 64 and 80. We can go into it in the Q&A if you want. And it's really Reagan that achieves success. And his version of neoliberalism is very strongly linked to states wanting their own rights and federal powers being diminished, right? And government, of course, being the problem. So you end up with a kind of neoliberalism, a pro-market story that is strongly anchored in states' rights. Now, in the EU, is a very different story, right? The European Economic Community Treaty got very ambitious for freedoms language from German ordo liberals in 1957. But the early goal was much more political, right? It was to stop war, forever abolish war between France and Germany. And few expected actually it to deeply limit national regulation. But as most people who study the EU know, it was really the European Court of Justice and the Commission that pushed their mandates in the 1970s, but actually without strong support from the member states. So as neoliberal ideas gained traction in the European context, especially in the UK with Margaret Thatcher into the 1980s, you had Thatcher, like Reagan, opposing strong central institutions. But the one thing she could get behind was the Single European Act deal in 1985-86, which is a kind of Europeanist reform with neoliberal substance. Thatcher agrees to this with misgivings, because she was worried there was going to be too much central authority. Delors and Mitterrand see this as getting socialism back via the European door. And of course, Thatcher knew this and was worried about it, but they had misgivings about the neoliberal part. So this creates a neoliberal project in the European Union that's building central authority, right? That basically pushes for market openness. So it generates a knowledge regime about completing a single market. And this explains to this day, right? Thatcherites actually pushing for Brexit because they basically still had Thatcher's misgivings. Too much EU authority, too much EU bureaucracy, right? So you had the Germans here on the single market, at least, was very different story for the euro, where this was very much a German euro. But Kohl's ordo-liberal sort of thinking on this was very much in the middle. Thatcher really wanted free markets and not too much central authority. Mitterrand really, who was a French socialist, really wanted EU central authority. And of course, Jacques Delors, his former finance minister, was European Commission president from 85 to 95. He's the one who steered this through, right? So in the end, Thatcher had to give in on EU political authority, Mitterrand had to give in on substance. But that's where you see the beginning of the single market being built from the top down rather than the bottom up. So for those of you who are interested in the EU and who study the EU, what are some of kind of EU-focused takeaways? First of all, and that I think is really the bigger story that I think especially an American audience doesn't really appreciate well enough, is that the EU's internal market authority is extraordinarily strong. It's far stronger than that of any federal state. So not the US, not Canada, not Australia, right? Which those three you would think of as traditionally pro-market, liberal market economies, if you want to use varieties of capitalism literature or speak. No other polity has ever aimed for such strong rules to complete a single market. And this is quite pervasive, and this is quite it's at least perceived, and I think it drives Euroscepticism in many ways, because today this is much more obvious, right? Is how present the EU is in people's lives. A lot of this is for the better, but a lot of this is perceived as, well, they're pushing things, whether it's labor market regulations, whether it's fiscal policy, of course, single monetary policy, industrial policy. That is a kind of one-size-fits-all model, and that doesn't allow countries discretion on things like this. On kind of free market rules. Institutional preferences for internal market regimes have major autonomy from substantive policy preferences, right? And so that's on other stuff, and I've written on this before, mostly in the context of the Eurozone. It seems to be coming at a price, this integration, right? Because it's systematically taking away national member state discretion. And so if you vote, let's say, to limit or to have, let's say, public procurement. You know, the Italians want to build a bridge from Sicily to the mainland, an old dream, right? If they wanted to do this, they would have to tender this to the whole of the EU. And they couldn't give, let's say, a 10% advantage, a home state advantage to Italian contractors, right? That would going against EU market regulation. That's not something that in America is possible, for example, right? I mean, even in certain states, you have to live in these states or be resident in these states to provide these services. And so on. So also that much EU discourse about incomplete, the market being incomplete, is misleading, right? And also I think naive in the sense that thinking that getting rid of more and more barriers that actually perfectly exist fine in the United States, that still exist to some extent in Europe, that this would somehow bring about faster growth. And so finally, what's the policy takeaway? And I think that's the kind of simplest, right? The policy takeaway for Europe is that the single market project is not likely to deliver US-style flows, and for that matter, US-style economic growth, right? You're going to be disappointed if that's what you expect. And maybe even more interesting, a policy takeaway for the United States, an American single market project like we have in Europe is actually worth considering, right? Because the flows are so much bigger here. And so just think about it. If you're an elevator company, you need, every different state has different regulations for elevators. Actually, in Illinois, it's even different for Chicago than for the rest of Illinois. So wouldn't it be great if a big elevator company didn't even have to worry about it, just had one standard for elevators all over the United States and not 50 different ones, right? And there's so many examples of this, right? What US businesses do, especially big businesses, they just tailor it to the state, and they don't question this. There's no active lobbying within the Republican Party, within the Democratic Party to get rid of this. So let me see. It is 4:30 here, so 1:30 here. You've given me half an hour, Anna. Happy to answer any and all questions. Thanks very much for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you for that wonderful talk. We already have some questions lined up. The first one is asks you to sort of situate this historically, right? Is it possible that this is just about the 10th Amendment to the US Constitution and the fact that at some point California and Texas were independent nations? right? So it maybe has something to do with some of the durable political institutions that were in place long before any kind of single market project took off.
I mean, it's a very good question, right? What's often done within EU studies, and I'm thinking of Michel Egan's work, but Sergio Fabrini, others, is they compare Europe today with the United States, let's say the Articles of Confederation or something like this, right? And then you're like, well, you know, Europe is actually doing quite well, right? I mean, they're actually going in that direction. So, and it makes sense to do that comparison from for many kind of questions that people want to ask. But if you think of the modern market economy, right? If you think of regulations of financial markets and the modern financial markets, basically, it's only really been in the last 50 years that there's been a kind of dramatic takeoff of legislation that's to do with markets, right? Safety, environmental, all these standards. And so what's striking is that at the same time as neoliberal ideas, market ideas are gaining traction in the United States and Europe, is that Europe takes this much further, right? Almost takes it to the next level, because they put it in an international treaty that is very hard to change only by unanimity, right? In the US, you can change anything you want with a simple majority, right? Well, as we know, in the Senate, you probably need 60 senators for most legislation, right? So to me, it seems at least counterintuitive to think that the identities of Illinois, of California, of Texas, of individual US states are somehow stronger than a German, a French, a British, an Italian pushback against kind of surrendering these powers. Because in the end, I mean, democracies, national democracies, want to respond to the legitimate demands of their citizens. The better way to respond is the more levers, policy levers you have available, right? Fiscal, monetary, industrial policies, single market regulation, labor market, and so on, financial markets. And the fact that you're giving up slowly in Europe, and then actually quite quickly in the 80s and the 90s, one policy lever after the other, where basically now not only is policy set at the center with you having very little influence over it, there's a court that can enforce it, that you're willing to do this, and that US states are much less reluctant to do this, especially if they believe in free markets much more than, especially, you know, traditionally more reluctant European countries who have much more faith in government to solve problems. That still seems to me to be incredibly puzzling. And so what's, I think the story to me that we keep coming back to is that, yeah, but free marketeers found a home in the Republican Party, and the coalition that basically the deal was, the opposite of the New Deal was, we are going to push through these ideas, small government ideas, and actually states' rights means that there's going to be very little interference with how many hours hairdressers have to go to school in the States, from all the way to what the curriculum is going to be in the schools, right? So that I see the point, right? That these things were long established and it was very hard to kind of surrender this, but it seems to me to be even harder in the European context after World War II, where these kind of national identities were to some extent even stronger.
So, by the way, I'd like to encourage everyone to submit the questions in the Q&A box. And before we go to the next one, though, you know, there's a different response to this, right? Which is that, well, it's not so, you know, it's what is the alternative, right? It's not just about the benefits, it's about the costs as well. And it may very well be that in the post-war environment, European states saw greater market integration as far more beneficial than the cost of staying alone and paying more attention to national identities. Whereas in the United States, those additional benefits that might come with greater trade integration just simply weren't worth the enormous political costs that state governors would have paid vis-a-vis their constituencies. So, you know, so I guess I'm asking you to engage with the counterfactual, or sort of, you know, the converse thinking of, you know, what would be the cost of not doing this, right?
Yeah, and there it seems to me that the benefits for the US would actually be significantly higher, than they were in. So
not politically.
No, but economically, right?
Right.
Of doing this. And so what I feel that in EU context is that member states are disappointed every step of the way in the additional benefits that come from the single market.
We have a very big question here about whether the European Union will last given these pressures and given these contradictions.
Yeah, I would have been much more sympathetic to the kind of disintegration of the EU 5 years ago, right? When there are clear kind of centrifugal forces there, and there's been kind of 10 years of integration crises that push them there. The last few years, and that's the kind of broader book project I'm working on, it seems to me there's a new consensus that's come together because of multiple factors, right? Brexit happens. The vote happens at least in June 23rd, 2016. People's first reaction is this is the beginning of the end to the EU. The UK will leave, Hungary will leave, Anna's Poland will leave, especially the countries that aren't in the euro, it's easier for them. Then you realize actually, no, there's Eurosceptics start to change in Eurosceptic land, right? They actually don't want to leave anymore. They don't want to leave the euro anymore, but they want to change the EU. And that puts pressure on centrist political forces as well to at least take some of these arguments seriously. It's really the Union of the UK that sees much more pressure today, much more so than the Union of the European Union. And I mean, it's not unthinkable that Scotland will have another independence referendum soon. And it's also not unthinkable that they'll vote to leave this time. Similar with Northern Ireland, right? Where now a significant minority in Northern Ireland believes that the future actually is with the rest of the island of Ireland, with the Republic of Ireland. So I think what you're seeing, Donald Trump helped European integration because it made many people in continental Europe realize that they can no longer blindly rely on US protection. Putin is helping it because they're real, and so is Xi Jinping's China, because Europeans are now starting to realize that their geopolitical competition, old-fashioned style, right, is back. And the only way that they can kind of respond to this is with a kind of what Macron calls EU sovereignty, what the European Commission prefers to call open strategic autonomy. It's all a bit vague, and people love to mock it. But it was also vague in the 80s when people talked about the market, because the market meant different things for different people, right? It meant growth for some, it meant protection for others, it meant profits for others. And so a vague concept is much easier diplomatically to get people to agree on it, right? And so it seems to me Europe has become, rather than purely focus on these single market rules and taking powers away, they've set up a recovery fund that's going to actually give some money to countries to show growth, right? To invest. And I think the big thing to watch really is the elections in Germany. If there's I mean, it's almost inevitable that the Greens will be in power. Whether they have the chancellor as well is a different story. It's a long summer still to come. But there's definitely a shift underway that wants to give member states a little bit more discretion again on some of these things. And so I think Brexit was a big wake-up call, as was the Euro crisis, right? And there's still that tendency there, especially in Germany, to push a kind of one-size-fits-all policy on everybody. That's clearly not working for every model. Next question, Anna?
So, the converse of that. So how could the United States implement stronger rules for an internal market and actually have a single market project? What do you see as sort of the political and economic obstacles and conduits towards that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main difference between Europe and the United States, of course, is that as I always say, the EU has the worst of both worlds, right? They have all the rules, they have all the regulations from Europe that they have to follow, which take away discretion on the nation state, the member state level. But they don't have any of the good stuff that comes from being part of a union, like federal deposit insurance, or like a Eurobond, even though there are limited Eurobonds now, one-off. We'll have to see how that evolves. Macroeconomic stabilization through fiscal policy, right? I mean, in the end, all the EU does is tell you can't spend money on this and you can't do this and you can't do that, but they don't send massive amounts. They don't send $1,400 checks to everybody like Joe Biden has just done, right? So it seems to me the licensing and services, the different regulations in many of those is one of those things that could be centralized, but it's going to be a hell of a job to get senators on board with this, right? Because again, states like to keep their discretion on many of these things, and there's many vested interests and there's many sensitive professions, right? I mean, which still I find striking. I mean, it's one thing for like, you know, Western Europe, especially when enlargement just happened, right? And you have doctors and these sensitive professions, right? Architects coming from, let's say, Romania or Bulgaria, that there's an immediate reaction. Oh my God, do they have the same standards? Do they have the same training? And especially, I mean, I'm not even going to the second class treatment that much of Eastern Europe is still getting today in Western Europe, right? But the idea that an Ohio lawyer is, you know, very suspicious of a Pennsylvania lawyer, I find that almost harder to understand. But I think it, from a political economy point of view, it would have to be linked to certain benefits that you get from the center, right? So if you, let's say there is a federal standard, and if you take on the federal standard, that comes with certain carrots or certain benefits in federal money and so on. And there does seem to be plenty of federal money around these days to be spent.
Well, could you say that, you know, basically California or Texas are in effect setting the standards? I mean, one of the huge battles over auto emissions was whether California could have a distinct standard because it set the agenda for everybody else. Yeah. And it's the same thing with, you know, markets for textbooks, where, you know, whatever Texas decides goes for half the country.
Yeah, these are good examples. And I think one of the major things that kind of baffles Americans when you tell them is that, I mean, this is something close to all of our hearts here, right? It's university tuition. So if Anna wants to send her kids eventually to a state school, let's say Anna wants to send her kids to Michigan. It's an excellent school. She used to teach there. She knows people there. You're going to pay 3 times the tuition to Michigan as you would pay in if you were still there, right? So in Europe, you can't do that. You can't discriminate. So if you're a Portuguese university, you have to charge the same tuition to a Polish citizen and a Greek citizen than you charge your Portuguese citizens, right? So it seems to me I mean, it would probably lead to a dramatic increase of tuition for in-state, right? Or it wouldn't actually lower anything like this. But that seems to me a clear case of discrimination, right? And then people try to game it all kinds of ways by moving there the year before and whatever. And again, it doesn't seem to be efficient, and it's the ones that have the flexibility of moving the year before that then can take, or have an address there or something like this that can take advantage of this. Most people cannot. But the California model, I think, and that's where I think during the Trump years, environmental activists, environmental scholars, most of the action was at the state level, right? Because it was not a race to the bottom anymore. They were kind of starting a race to the top. That said, from an economic point of view, it's all terribly inefficient, right? I mean, it basically means firms constantly have to adapt. And you would think that producer groups, interest groups, and so on would have an interest in getting together and coming up with a federal rule that applies in every single state. And that is something that every business would support. Let's say you don't even touch public procurement for a moment, right? Where, of course, in-state, there's a clear advantage. And governors, for obvious reasons, when they spend public money, like to spend it on local workers, right? Which is something you cannot do in the European context. Of course, in practice, a lot of this is still done locally, but the fact that they've taken that away, I think, is significant.
So there's another question here about these kinds of comparisons. So you argue the United States had no urgent need for market regulation that the EU pursued. So could we apply that logic in reverse to EU centralized social policy? That there was really no need for it because these countries individually had pretty strong social policies, so there was no need for coordination. Yeah,
that's a good question. That's an excellent question. I mean, it depends again, right? There are clear. What worries me as somebody who thinks European integration is a good thing is that the last 10 years have seen dramatic divergence again in standards of living, especially north-south, but to some extent east and west. I mean, even in the center and east of the European Union, there's some countries that are catching up faster. Actually, Hungary and Poland doing quite well, others not, that are lagging, right? And so to say, well, yeah, everybody has a pretty decent social policy, that then means that the countries with the lowest social policy are kind of stuck there, right? So it's a difficult question because it does seem much more political somehow, right? Is to have an EU-wide social policy. So here again, you could have certain, and I also think this is what I was trying to say with whenever I talk about EU integration, I actually, going back to the first question about, you know, worries about that it could all fall apart, right? And then I say, actually, if you look at the Americans, they're a lot more pragmatic at this stuff, right? When it comes to states' rights. So to me, this is linked to democracy, right? And democracy in the end is about trade-offs, right? If we go with the stereotype and Greek voters are willing to go with earlier pensions and earlier retirement ages, and that leads to lower growth or that leads to less productivity, I think they should be allowed to make that choice, right? It shouldn't be enforced from, especially not the European Central Bank, that their retirement age should be 67 or 69 or whatever, right? So if you want to create these EU level type policies, then I think there has to be much more consensus on this. And that's where I think you still have this sort of like national democracies and EU technocrats, right, that are setting policies. And then once it's set, there's actually very little discretion and choice within it, right? Is there a need for a US social policy? I mean, clearly Joe Biden seems to think so, and it seems to be very popular because he's just about to roll it out, right? I mean, it's part of the broader infrastructure bill that he's pushing. I mean, at least the kind of social side, anything from maternity, parental leave to universal pre-K education and things like that. But again, it seems to me it's easier to impose this in the United States, where there is a federal government capable of doing it, where in the EU, it would really mean the last thing that member states still have, taxation powers. They would have to give up part of this as well. And that I think is going to be a lot harder to achieve. But I'm going to have to think about this a little more, Christophe, that question, and maybe get back to you via email, if that's okay.
Well, I guess, you know, I wanted to push you perhaps unfairly. What makes market integration different from social policy coordination as an issue area, or as, you know, as an economic question, as a political question?
Yeah, I mean, both are incredibly political, right? It's just that I think, yeah, they're just such different preferences on it. But that's with market integration as well. I think the success of the coalition that pushed for the single market so successfully, almost naively so, was to think that this was actually not that political, that this was something everybody was doing, right? I mean, you know Eastern Europe much better than I do, Anna, but I mean, if you see how neoliberal policies were pushed in much of Central and Eastern Europe, it was embraced with almost the zeal of a convert by many policymakers in the 90s, right? And that they now realize, like, this actually, first of all, didn't lead to the promised results that we thought, and it did create massive winners and losers. And then to say this was just a kind of optimum policy that there was no alternative to, I think is now clear that there are these choices that need to be made. So that, to me, is the main problem of Europe today, right? Is that, and then to some extent it's present in the United States as well, because red states and blue states do want very different things when it comes to social policy, and for that matter, single market policy, states' rights versus federal powers. And so I think that tension is there in both places. It's just interesting that they made such different choices, and neither seems to be particularly happy with the equilibrium they ended up with.
It's rather ironic. This morning I was talking about the elite consensus that existed in East Central Europe around neoliberal reform that basically spanned the entire political spectrum, which of course obviates that problem. So another question here is about diffusion, right? So do you think that regional economic integration projects like Mercosur, the Andean community, and others are a response to the single market project in Europe? And if so,
Yeah.
how?
I think this was definitely the case in the 1990s and the 2000s, right? Which, in hindsight, the older I'm getting, and I am getting older, and of course, I mean, I was kind of a teenager in the 90s, and then grad school in the 2000s. So it seemed like it was normal, and at the time, that period, and it seemed like this was the way of the future. And now, the more you look back to it, is that this period between 1989 and, let's say, 2008, or maybe, if you want to be more generous, 2015, was a fairly unique period where we thought that getting rid of barriers, trade, capital flows, and integration was going to lead to the kind of promised land of higher living standards, lower unemployment, and so on. More, I mean, and it was even going to lead to peace, right? I mean, that was the kind of belief, and I think in many ways, Mercosur, ASEAN, NAFTA even were responses to the success, the perceived success of the European single market and the euro. Don't forget, I mean, what's amazing about that period from 92 to 2008 is a country like Greece was roughly 56% of German standards of living in 92. By 2008, they were at 80% of German standards of living. Today, they're back at 47%. So that's how quickly something can go as well, right? A good news story. So I think the flows are similar in the sense within Latin America and Southeast Asia, is that they're like where Europe was in the 50s, and that the belief was that if you get rid of these barriers, this will create faster growth again. But the climate after World War II, it seems to me, was a lot more benign in Europe than it is today in these other parts of the world, because there's much more competition, right? I mean, there's the role of China in integration. There's competing blocks much more. And I think also the last 10 years of multiple crises of European integration, especially the Euro crisis, has given many, many countries pause for thought, like, do we want to give up this many policy levers? Because that's what European member states have done, right? And it's interesting because the pushback when it comes to states' rights comes actually from Hungary and Poland today, right? And they're saying, well, like, we have our own judiciaries, and when it comes to the rule of law, we have a different interpretation and things like this. And of course, every time the German Constitutional Court rules against the next ECB largesse, they're applauding it, because they're saying, seeing these EU institutions go too far, and that's just the same as the EU trying to tell us we can't stack our courts, or we can't shut down our media, or anything like this. And so I think in other parts of the world where there are more authoritarian tendencies still, and actually some of them are getting stronger, the last thing that those leaders will want to do is give up more discretionary power. So it looked like that was the way of the world when I started teaching political economy and IPE and so on in 2008. It looks much less the case today.
And as always, there's a pertinent question here, a highly contemporaneous one, about the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And how that's might stimulate further change in the market policy, given that it's basically led to a complete stop in the free flow of goods, services, capital, and people.
Yeah, I mean, that was the moment I really thought this could be it, right? And the moment was 13 months and 10 days roughly ago.
But who's counting?
March 10, March 12, March 13, 2020, when it's not even an irony, the tragedy of the COVID-19 crisis was that it hit Spain and Italy, the worst, the first. And these were the two countries, big Southern European countries, that for 10 years had been cutting spending on public health, public infrastructure. They're hit by this crisis, and the first reaction in Germany and France is to close the borders, to have export bans for PPE, for ventilators, for things like this. And then you have Chinese and Russian airplanes land in Barcelona and Madrid and in Rome to provide these things. And then you have Christine Lagarde, who was very new as a central banker, who was a very good finance minister and IMF managing director, but very new to central banking, saying, this is not our job to close the spreads between Italian and German. And this was probably the biggest one-day disaster in Italian stock markets. And it really caused a lot of anger in Italy. And other countries as well. I mean, Serbia, Western Balkans that were excluded and out later. But so I think Europe corrected this relatively quickly, I think surprisingly so. And I think that the most important figure there was Angela Merkel's U-turn, right? I mean, she embraced a European recovery fund that I never thought she would do. I mean, this is a woman who said in 2012 in a Bundestag debate, there will not be any Eurobonds zolange ich lebe, as long as I live. She's still alive, she's still chancellor, and she did it anyway, right? So that's, I think, how this crisis kind of catalyzed a much more solidarity Europe. And if you look at the plans Mario Draghi, the Italian prime minister, is rolling out, $230 billion worth of infrastructure spending. I mean, if this comes to fruition, and this has the stamp of Europe on it, that could be a very different, that could be the beginning of a very different decade for European integration, where I think that the Brits will slowly come to regret that they're no longer part of this, right? Because they will realize that, you know, in the end, it's a world of US, of big powers, big blocks, and they're going to have a very uncomfortable, I mean, they're feeling very good right now because their vaccinations are going faster, right? But in a few months, that's just going to look exactly the same. And then they're going to have to find something else. So that's maybe one positive note to end on for European integration, right? As I've spent pretty much my whole career looking at financial crises, all kinds of crises of integration, it now seems to be a moment where they're more in the mode of 85, 95, that decade where they built a lot, set in place a lot. Of course, the crises were in many ways a result of the flaws of these institutions they designed back then, that I hope they can now correct and kind of come around a new consensus around EU sovereignty or something like this, where everybody can kind of have their own definition, but they can kind of vaguely agree, as Europe always eventually does, around a new project that gives more discretion to national democracies to kind of decide and make the choices their electorates want them to make.
Well, Matthias, thank you so much. It's a wonderful way to end on this note of democratic accountability, international solidarity, and British regret. So thank you very much. This is an absolutely fantastic talk. I know that I'm joined by many others who thought it was fantastic, and thank you so much. Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.